those things that Jesus implied by his actions. But I think there's 2 or 3 other thoughts, if I could share those when we start or sometime during the day.
Or for the gospel, you mean? Or?
Well, really any time, really. They're kind of global thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Don't have anybody online yet, so.
I heard Fred.
I heard somebody.
No, it was the Zoom saying that the meeting is in progress.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna see Greg's figure. The outline.
It's not hard to miss.
All right. Well, how is everyone today?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, no complaints.
No. Oh, I've got lots. Do you want this?
It just doesn't do any good.
Lots.
Yeah.
Listen,
So how are you? Well, actually, okay.
Maybe only 10% of what you have.
No, I woke up this morning and it was cooler than it had been.
Yes. Yeah.
Then I thought, okay, I'm gonna get that breezeway swept out. It's got 6 inches of dirt on it now.
our thermometer said 70.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Really?
that's the beginning of a good day.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's
Great.
like,
80 is the beginning of a bad day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 19. It's bad. 74.
I did see there is 70% humidity.
Yeah, pretty high.
Yeah.
So
You know,
yeah.
it's West.
Mhm.
Ah,
Yeah.
Oh, can't you
Yeah, it's
feel
been
it?
hard.
Yeah.
Like humidity. Sprinklers are basically useless.
Yeah.
And after that little bit of rain yesterday, I could smell the bushes.
right. Oh, it smells
Horrible.
so good. Yeah. No, I love the smell.
Yeah.
But then it's,
I
Trying to
go,
process that one.
I go swimming every morning, And this morning was the first morning I got in the water. It actually felt kind of cold.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You
I
have
was kind of shocked for a few minutes until I had to start swimming real fast. Like I got to warm up quick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you must have you have a pool.
No, this is they have a pool open up on the base now.
Oh,
They finally opened.
Oh, that opened up.
They're the old
Well,
office
it's
stuff.
been open for a long time, but it was only open for military.
Yeah, yeah.
And current workers. They finally opened it to everybody.
that's great.
Anybody that can get in there.
At the old officer stuff. That what it is?
Yeah, it's called the Oasis Pool. It's where the officers. Club is.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
so it's an outdoor pool.
not that you have.
Yeah. Nice.
Cool. Might have to go swim with you one day.
Yeah. I'm always the first one there.
Oh yeah. What time do you go?
I go at 5:30 when they open.
Oh,
Mm.
no wonder it's cold. The water will be cold at 5:30. Yeah.
Well, the air was a little bit cooler this
Yeah,
morning.
that's
I think
it.
that makes a difference. The
Yes. it
water
does.
was probably the same temperature, but I wasn't warmed up like I usually am.
Hi.
Hello.
And now we can start.
We've been waiting.
All right, well, let's pray. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for a little bit cooler weather this morning. And I just thank you that we can be here together and that we can read your word. I pray that you will prepare our hearts and our minds and our bodies to receive what you have for us. Pray that we will be able to carry forth what we learn. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah, would you like to share what you had in mind?
Oh, yeah, I remember
But,
a few weeks ago when I was here, I was kind of like saying that, well, Jesus maybe he didn't necessarily like, but he didn't mind being interrupted.
Mm.
And there's a lot of things in the Gospels that Jesus kind of implied. He didn't necessarily talk about them, but the way he conducted himself. And the first one, of course, was he was willing to be interrupted. And many scenes like that, like the paralytic that he was talking in a building and they opened up the rope and lower it down. And you notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "Oh, come back later, I'm busy." And he kind of stopped what he was doing immediately and, tended to what he was, this paralytic. And that happens a lot of places where, like the woman who tugs on his garment, when he's walking, he doesn't say, "Oh, leave me alone. Don't you see I'm busy?" I always think about what the normal human reaction to things like
What
that.
are you doing?
Yeah, don't you see I'm busy right now? Come back later. But he never did that. He always was willing to stop. And it doesn't matter, he had an agenda to be sure, but he never was willing to, he was always willing to look at what happened around him.
Right.
But the other extension from that is not only did he not mind being interrupted, but he noticed people and things around him, like the blind man by the side of the road that was just calling out. He wasn't necessarily interrupted, but he kind of stopped and dealt with that. And of course, you have the account of Nicodemus up in the tree.
Yeah.
I don't know how conspicuous Nicodemus is, but it really wasn't an interruption. He could have stopped continuing, but he kind of called out to Nicodemus. So, and those are very important criteria that we could learn. Is one, look at interruptions as something important to do, and not to try to. People often will say, "Well, I'm going to do this and this today, provided I don't have any interruptions." Well, maybe the interruptions are the important things.
Right.
And I think always being aware of things and people around you, people that and maybe you haven't seen them for a long time, and be willing to pay attention to that. And then the third part of that is all of these things that happen were always a teaching moment. He took these interruptions and these other things that happened. And like I said, he had an agenda, that he was progressing on, but he was always willing to be spontaneous and deal with whatever the interruption or whatever was going on around them, and being very aware of that. And the other thing that I noticed is that Jesus taught in a kind of an indirect manner. Maybe in a secretive manner, like when he tells the parables after he goes in and explains the parable to his apostles, but then he says, "To you it's being revealed, but to the rest they have to listen but not hear." He kind of quotes that he does that in some ways. But I think what that means is he wants his followers to seek. And he says that in the Sermon on the Mount, seek and you will find, knock and you'll listen. He calls everybody, but in a way he wants people to kind of seek and spend some time to do it. And often in the Gospels, he says hard sayings, which he does in this chapter 6 of John. He says some hard things, and then some people leave and go away. And then he says to, Peter and the other apostles, "Well, are you going to go away too?" And he wants volunteers. He'll give them the truth and teach and expect them to see, but yet they have the option of walking away. He's not going to force anybody to do anything. So he wants volunteer followers. And I think those are important things to notice. And in a way, maybe he says that in some ways, but yet they're kind of things that he does by his actions that are kind of subtle in how he conducts himself through the Gospels, and just seeing how that is. That's kind of another form of learning, to see how does Jesus conduct himself around people. And he has these very outstanding qualities that we need to remember and try to emulate in some way. So I think that's the 4 things that I was kind of going to share. And I'm sure there's others if you think about it. Sometimes I'll read a passage in the Gospel and say, "Oh, there's another characteristic there that I didn't see before." And I always tell people, you know, in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John, I bet I've read them 100 times or maybe more. But every time I look at it, there's something new. It's like they're never ending accounts that you can read them all your life, and every time you read it again, there's something there that you didn't notice before. And it depends on what you're thinking about at the moment, and you know what strikes your attention. And I often talk to people, and they said, "Well, have you ever read the Gospel of Mark?" In that case, and says, "Well, yeah, I read it once a long time ago, but I don't need to read it again." Well, that's kind of strange. I read it. I was kind of being facetious. I said, "You must be much smarter than I am, because I've read it 100 times, and I still don't have it all figured out." So that's another characteristic of Jesus' ministry. He's not just going to lay it on the table. It's going to be kind of a mystery to it that you can always come to a higher level of understanding, but you're not going to reach the perfection. And that's what he wants his followers to do, to always seek and look, even though you're never really going to get, you know, till you get to heaven, so to speak, you're not going to get there. But you don't want people to give up and say, so often people give up today and they say, well, that's too hard and too big of a problem, I'm not even going to try. And I think that's a mistake. You know, you have to kind of try and do what you can. And they say about the problems in the world, you know, the poverty and the homelessness, they say, well, what can I do about it? I'm just a drop in the bucket, you know, compared to this problem. But I often think, well, everybody can put little drops in there, and maybe 1,000 or 1,000,000 drops adds up to a lot. Yeah. Anyway, that's more than I was going to say. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I think you raised some valuable points. One of which I was thinking how our whole goal as Christians is to become more like him, right? You mentioned that. And so how do we become like him? Well, we learn like him. And I think one of the things that, or kind of an underlying thing that you've mentioned, is his behaviors, right? His behavior is one that's moldable almost. It's one that's able to be shifted, like he's going with the flow, like you're saying, being interrupted with how he speaks and how he interacts with people. It's it's awesome to see how God is using Jesus in his ministry so that we can become like him, right? So when we talk about being interrupted, we are so goal oriented or business oriented, achievement oriented, right, that we miss the underlying behavior of being interrupted and seeing what's in front of us, right?
And I know I've kind of taken up the task, because sometimes I would be in the store and I'll see somebody that from a distance, and I say, well, I know that person, but I don't remember his name. And I know I worked with him, but I don't know when, where, and how. And I'll kind of say, well, I didn't want to embarrass myself by going over and saying that. But now I've gotten over that. I'll go over and say, well, you know, I know you from somewhere, but I don't remember where. And then, of course, you get into a little bit of a dialogue.
The light bulb.
Then finally he tells me where I worked with him. He says, oh, now I remember who you are.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a matter of getting over our embarrassment and our, what do you call it, to be willing to admit that we don't know somebody, and just to kind of connect with somebody again.
Yeah. So that steps on my toes a little bit. I've forgotten your name.
Oh, Bill.
Bill, that's right. Yeah, I obviously know you and recognize you, but your name has just escaped. So thanks for stepping on my toes. So that's my.
And it gets worse as you get older.
Sure.
I don't know how many people I see places and I said, I know that person from somewhere, but I was involved with Boy Scouts and Cancer Society, and I worked, and I have no idea which of those places it was.
Yeah. So one of the underlying things is our sanctification, right? That's what you're kind of driving at, is that we are becoming like Christ. And that means that we have to set aside our own pride and
Yeah.
kind of accept that we are frail and that our minds can forget names or forget places and all of that stuff, right? But in that, God's grace is making us strong and really testifying to who he is and his graciousness. Right.
And we're very goal oriented. I've gone to some conferences, and sometimes I'll go to a conference and the person, well, he's got PhD and all a bunch of letters after his name, And I think, well, it wasn't that interesting. Then you'll go to a session that's just a no name, just has his name with no credentials. And then after a while, I think, wow, it was the best presentation that I was at all that day or however long it was. And the problem is, so often we're so anxious to have a bunch of letters after our name, a bunch of credentials that, we're good because of all these things we did in the past.
Mhm.
But I think that's another thing that Jesus gets after what you call it, the scribes and the Pharisees in Jerusalem. They tended to want to rest on their laurels when things happened in the past. And they would say things like, well, we're descendants of Abraham. And Jesus would say, well, out of these rocks, I can create descendants of Abraham.
Yeah.
So he's not saying that being a descendant of Abraham is a bad thing, but you don't want to have that be a source of pride.
Mhm.
And say that all of the credentials we had in the past are going to talk for us. We have to deal with where we are today. And that's another thing that Jesus always does. He took people where they were today, like the Canaanite woman and the Roman centurion, which generally the Jews don't like these Gentiles and the Romans. But Jesus saw faith in the person wherever they were, where they were right at that moment. It didn't matter what their background was. The fact that they were Gentiles and maybe pagans and whatever else, it's where you are today that's more important, and not what happened in the past. It's more like where you're going or where you're heading is more important than what happened in the past and where you were in the past. It's a matter of a new conversion.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to digress.
That's right. I think it'll fit well within our lessons, but I was going to say it, that all kind of reminds me of the Little Prince, right? You guys remember the story of the Little Prince? Yeah. Of the little kid who's trying to save his Boaz, right? Or what is it? Now I've forgotten, he's trying to save his flower, right? The rose, and their sheep trying to, I don't know now. But kind of the underlying thing is not getting stuck in what we're doing in our business and doing very important things, but enjoying the sunrise over and over again and little things. But yeah, I think your comments are more profound than the story. But anyway, we'll read the collect and we'll continue on. Almighty and merciful God, it is only by your grace that your faithful people offer your true and laudable service. Grant that we may run without stumbling to obtain your heavenly promises. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. What's something that sticks out to you from this collect?
Well, I see faithful people kind of sticks out, and then also the next line without stumbling. I think that's the highlights that I see.
Yeah. What's a mark of a faithful person?
One that perseveres, I think, and like Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, somebody who searches and perseveres and is willing to be interrupted, I should say, and not let quote bad things that happen be a breaking point, a stumbling point. You have to persevere not only through good times but also bad times.
Yeah. And that connects with running without stumbling.
Yeah.
Right? We're running this race, and running requires perseverance and endurance.
And I think the stumbling also reminds me of the parable of the sower in the second group, the one that falls among thorns. And they said it gets caught up and distracted by the cares of the world. And that's kind of the cares of the world are often a stumbling block. So let us be, something that distracts people and sometimes permanent.
Right.
A lot of the things that they said here kind of permeate into Jesus' ministry. The things that he said here.
Yeah. What does laudable mean?
Praiseworthy.
Yeah. Deserving praise and commendation. True and laudable service. Yeah, so we offer that kind of service, well, always, but specifically in the Eucharist, right? That's the service in which we remember what Christ has done, and we partake of those mysteries, and we'll get into those mysteries a little bit today in our readings.
I think the word laudable is important because we want the service to be laudable. Usually means something that is praised or noticed by others. But I think the important part there is it's something that's laudable according to God and according to the works of Jesus. It's not necessary, it doesn't mean it can be laudable by trying to get a lot of public attention. It's not an ego thing.
Yeah.
So we're trying to see how people around us see how great we are. It's like doing your service in silence. So to speak.
Yeah.
That's what I think of being truly laudable. Do something important, and you don't expect to get accolades and everything. So people to point to you and say, "Oh, look how he's such a wonderful person," because of these things by boasting. I want to let your service become a source of boasting and pride.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And those are the most important things to do, is things to do that nobody notices. Yeah. Again, it's like the account where in the synagogue, where the rich person comes up with all of his gowns and puts a large sum in offering. And at first he does that to get a lot of attention and everything, say, look how wonderful I am. But then the widow kind of sneaks up in the background and puts a little bit in, and she's not noticed by anybody else. That he just kind of commends the little service that is done in true gratitude. What you call it. He's trying to get attention from the right place, not just from the people around him.
And she gave all she had, as the other of the party didn't give all of it.
Yeah, that was probably 1/10 of a %.
Anything to contribute.
That's why we see on the news all the time that some wealthy person, gives $1 million to something. Right? And you don't realize that this wealth is like $100 billion. And what percentage is $1 million compared to this multi-billion? Probably 0.01%. And he's probably doing it in order to get his name on the building or get some public attention and having news media around taking pictures like that.
And then not paying as much taxes,
Yeah.
Doing it to get public attention. Yeah. It's different if somebody were to come up and donate that money and say, I'm going to donate this in secret. I don't want you to tell anybody where it came from. Well, then it would be kind of commendable. Not doing it for public attention.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're asking God to help us to run without stumbling, right? And so that we may obtain these heavenly promises. We've talked about these heavenly promises over the course of a few or last month, it seems like. I think seems to be um, a recurring theme, and I think it's tied with our Ephesians passage mainly. So yeah, what again are some of those heavenly promises that we're gaining, we're seeking to obtain? Yeah, right. Yeah, freedom from sin and
Peace.
Yeah. peace. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's,
Yep. Forgiveness of sin.
and I think it's to find true happiness
Mhm.
and learning to find out what that is. Sometimes the happiness that people talk about on earth is very temporal and short lasting. And for me, and it's a matter of learning, what's really true happiness and what is just kind of a flash
Mhm.
for today and disappears tomorrow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, true happiness. Yeah, that's good. All right, let's get into Exodus. Can I have somebody read that for us, please? All right.
The Old Testament was written in the book of Exodus, and the 16th chapter begins with the second verse. The whole congregation, people of Israel, stumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to bring bread from heaven to you, and the people shall go out and gather those portions every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. And when the morning dew lay down, and when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine white light, one cross on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is bread that the Lord has given you to eat. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I just realized so there are a lot of diets that come out of the Old Testament. Like you heard of the Ezekiel bread, or the Daniel fast, where you just eat all fruit. But you never hear anything about eating quail in the evening and bread in the morning. Huh? I haven't, at least.
That sounded very good.
Oh yeah. Well, that was my attempt at humor. Greg, I think you're a little bit better. Yeah, this is a full passage. There's a lot going on. Yeah. So we have been kind of following, I think, the life of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. So here we see kind of a key characteristic of the Israelites, which is grumbling. Yeah, what do you find interesting about what they're grumbling about?
I find it interesting that's the word you describe it. It's not, I have heard your cries and I've come to help. It's like, all right, I heard you grumbling.
Yeah,
I get it.
yeah,
Very different in attitude.
But I like the fact that it's not chastising them really, because it looks like the one thing that God, in this instance anyway, pays off. Because God's going to do something about
Mm.
it. So it's okay to grumble, yes.
Yeah. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I have two cats and they're kind of on the
Well,
That's a joke. That's a joke. I never would.
yeah, I think it's attitude, right? So
Yeah.
they should have simply asked for God to provide something
Yes.
rather than grumble, right? Like the cats, they, like, for example, I guess, they can't really ask you politely to feed them. They just whine for it, right? So you both know that it's about feeding time. But so in the case of the Israelites, it would have been better if they were to ask, right?
Anyway, it's on site. They're grumbling. I always get the feeling that they would have complained no matter what.
Right.
And it's- but as I mentioned, I got the fix.
You do.
However, it's kind of a slap in the face when you put that food down and she walks over and she sniffs it. And she looks up at it and she looks back and then she gets covered. I just took it out of the can. What do you think it is? Well, it's not what it is. See, and I always get that feeling from this. It's better, we should have stayed in Egypt and remained slaves and probably been worked and starved to death.
Mm.
But to be out here in the wilderness. Well, that doesn't make good sense.
It does make you feel like, you see that same phenomenon with addicts. You can show them the way to get sober and clean, and there's fear and trepidation there. Because this is all new to them,
Mm.
you know, but they know that what the Israelites know was being slaves. And when they got fed, it wasn't the greatest thing on the planet. But fed, it did not.
Yeah.
There wasn't anything unknown about it. You know, so crappy.
Mm.
But being out in the wilderness for that long, scary. I don't know.
Right.
You know, that requires a lot to trust in God. You know, like that. And a lot of them weren't capable of it.
Mm.
I think it's very human. I think we would do things like that. I think it's really understandable.
And this is kind of a, being in slavery is kind of a stumbling block, like they ask in college. People often prefer to be in slavery rather than really be free because they have a certain amount of comfort in it.
Mm.
And that's again, one of the things that Jesus complained with the Pharisees and the elite Jews in Jerusalem, that they had this nice comfortable position, even though it wasn't really a holy position, but they were comfortable, so they just wanted to preserve that comfort. And that's what the Israelites are saying here. They'd really rather be in that semi-comfortable situation than be out there and not knowing what's going to happen. And of course, they didn't realize that their comfortable situation was contingent on them working hard they were in slavery, and the slaves that didn't work very hard, they got, they kind of got put out of their misery.
Yeah.
So to speak. So as long as they worked really hard, 12 hours a day or whatever, then they got fed. But the comfort they had was very, very conditional on what you call an arbitrary master, so to speak,
Right.
that's going to do away with them. If two of them get into a fight, they'll probably execute both of them or something.
Mhm.
Or if they take a break from working and say, well, that person is out the door.
Mhm.
And that's a stumbling block I think people have today. Often they prefer comfort than really taking a risk to go out and do something.
Mhm.
It's like me, like when I saw somebody I knew over there, I preferred the comfort of just, I'll just kind of go on my way and pretend. I might wave at the guy pretending like I know. But if you go out, you have to go out of your way a little bit sometimes.
Mhm.
Maybe be embarrassed or go through some pain and agony.
Right.
And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and they've forgotten that they were crying out to the Lord in Egypt,
Yeah.
right? So that's why the Lord sent Moses. The Lord says, I have heard the cry of my people, so go and bring them to a place that I've prepared.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, then they grumbled.
That's what you said, they were going to, no matter what.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it's saying here is the Lord has said that to the people before, but it's especially true with Jesus, is that whenever you want some big goal, there's going to be some difficulty and obstacle you have to get through.
Mm.
And that's true with everything you do. If you want to go to school and get a good education, that's not just going to be handed to you on a plate. You're going to have to go through some pain and agony to do that. And the same thing, like I'm sure all of you know, if you've been married to the same person for a long time, it's not all sweet and lovely every minute. You're going to have some obstacles and difficulties to kind of get through. And the same thing with having children as they grow up and get in their teenage years. They're not going to be perfect angels every bit of their life. You're going to have to put up with some pain and agony.
Mm.
So I think the whole lesson, one of the big lessons from this whole reading is whenever you want to, what they're trying to teach the Israelites, which is being difficult, whenever you want to achieve a good end, which means settle the promised land and you don't have a country of your own over where they're headed. In order to do that, you're going to have to go through some ordeal, some pain, some agony
Right.
to get there. But they're kind of grumbling, somehow they had the false idea that if they got out of Egypt and got out of slavery, it was just going to be bliss and happiness 24 hours a day from them. They had kind of a false idea. But again, like Jesus said to the scribes in Jerusalem, have you not read the scriptures?
Yeah.
If they really look back at their own history, so to speak, there's always been some times of pain and agony that they've had to go through in order to really come to the truth.
But the thing in here, it's, they would prefer living with what they knew that with the uncertainty of the future. Now they're out in the desert, they don't want to eat food, they don't know where they're going to get their next meal. As in Israel, in Egypt, they were fed, they knew what they had.
Yeah.
And and that's very human, the
Yeah.
future when one of us know what the future is. And we're scared.
Yeah. Yeah, the scriptures say here that we sat by the meat pots.
Yes.
Just kind of thinking about the comfortability of sitting next to your refrigerator,
Yes.
right? And having that comfortability and knowing that you would be able to eat bread to the full, as they say. So they are lacking that imagination of what God can do, right? And in a sense, it makes sense that they are lacking that imagination because
Yeah.
they've been in Egypt for 500 years.
They're putting God in a box, so to speak, saying
Right.
that God can do this and this, and it isn't working out, so there must be something wrong.
Mhm.
Their God is too small. So to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
And this whole thing, of course, it's a precursor to what Jesus is going to do. But the people didn't understand that when he said, when Peter confessed that, you are the Christ, at the confession of Peter. And then Jesus started saying that the Son of Man, meaning Jesus was going to go up to Jerusalem, suffer, be put to death, and rise on the third day. Peter immediately objected, like, I'll never let that happen to you.
Yeah.
But what did Jesus say back to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. And it was a tough lesson for the apostles to learn that there's going to be some pain and agony, and maybe pain and agony to the degree that they never imagined to happen.
Yeah.
And in order to achieve a good end.
Mhm.
And I think, the death of Jesus on the cross is probably the greatest pain and agony that any people could go through.
Right.
But it was the greatest goal,
Mhm.
that's far exceeds anything that we have before that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a precursor to that it's kind of subtle. There's a lot more to go through before
Right.
we get there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, part of the problem they had too is like, same problem we always had. Is that you don't want the God that is, you want the God that. They
Yeah.
weren't happy, but they wanted to be free. Okay? Well, they weren't happy in the manner that he did it. They wanted the God of their own.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
And
like, it's like if we offer a prayer and Lord, show me the way to go. You really need to be open to what that's going to be, and you don't want to close your mind to think, well, I think it means like this. And the Lord may show you a path, and you say, I don't want to go that way.
yeah.
Show me the path I want.
Yeah, I think it's always important to kind of reflect on what God is doing with the Israelites. I think it's really easy to make the Israelites into kind of a whipping boy in terms of what they did wrong. And in a sense, we see ourselves in them, right at the end of the day. But it's important to note kind of throughout the whole Old Testament or throughout the scriptures, where I think to see the Israelites in their infancy stage. So they're in the process of learning, just like any infant. And I think that's why God uses Moses in the way that he does, to show them how big God is. And we'll kind of read a little bit about that perspective in the Psalms. But God is showing them how awesome he is and how much bigger he is than the gods of Egypt. And he's leading them along. And we kind of get this in the next bit here. He tells the people to get enough bread from heaven for a day only, right? A day's portion. So we'll kind of circle back to this daily bread in a little bit. But then he says that I might test them. So how are we to understand this testing? I thought God doesn't test his people. Yeah.
But it would have been a terrible temptation when you see the stuff to keep well and require you need for another day. But he says not to do that.
Mm.
But I think that's very human. Right? The mother would run and from whatever.
Right.
To make sure I have something for tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's very tempting.
So there's a difference in being tested and being tempted. So in Hebrew, the word is tested, not tempted. So the difference is that being tested is to prove. If you think about bread proving, it's being risen, right? It's going through a process in which it's becoming better in a sense, right? Another sense is it's finding the quality of that individual, those people. So testing is essentially this proving of the character of the people rather than being tempted. Being tempted is being enticed to sin. right? So there's a fundamental difference between what God is doing here. God doesn't tempt, but in this sense, he is testing, he is allowing this these circumstances to happen so that the people are able to choose to rely on him, right? And that's what we see happen in our own lives. We have all of these decisions before us and these circumstances before us to help us to lean on who God is. What better place to lean on him than in the wilderness? Right? We see that in the next little bit here. Moses says to Aaron, say to the congregation, to the people of Israel, come near, right? And I've boxed that as kind of a priority to pinpoint that we are to come near before the Lord, for he has heard their grumblings. And he says the whole congregation of the people, or that's Aaron speaking to the whole congregation of the people, and they say, look toward the wilderness. So we have a really interesting directional word here, looking toward the wilderness as opposed to looking back, right? We have kind of the option to look forward or look back. And it's as if the writer here is saying that we can only draw nearer to the Lord when we go deeper into the wilderness. So it's interesting to make that notation. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's an ongoing, I have to trust him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know if I do, but, like that, abundance, right?
Right. Yeah, we like to sit next to our meat pots. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so does that mean that we're to, what does that mean for us then? What do we do? How do we live a life that is reliant on God while still having stuff or having, what we need? How are we to live?
That's where it comes in the scriptures. Is want to know God.
Mm.
That's how we think about that. Scriptures.
Mm.
That's paramount.
But you answer the question, how do we really relying on God, what we have, what we need? It's harder. Particularly, I mean, if you're extremely wealthy. Well, I think Jesus said it's easier for poor men to go, right. And it's true. I mean, if you've got everything, you've got, a beautiful home and you've got, and then an apartment in Paris or London or whatever. You've got everything you need. You don't need God.
Mm.
When you think you don't need God.
Mm.
I mean, it is. It's got to be a temptation to think that, well, I've done it. My hard work or my smart or whatever, or some people inherit wealth, so they don't do anything. They just get it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a in order because they have never known deprivation or they have never known what it is, what you are looking at your head and everything you need.
Right.
It's harder, I would say. I don't know. I won't be so. I don't know.
Well, you are considered or kind of compared to some people in the world, right?
You're right. Yes, compared like the moment. That's nothing.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
It's kind of like, people tend to fall into the original sin by saying, I can do it all myself. I can rely on myself, on the wells of the stored up stuff. And it's like the parable of the person, the farmer that stores up all these riches in the barn and all these crops and says, look, I'm set. I've got everything I need. I got all this food stored up. I can do it myself. And many times, yeah, something like that happened. That's what Jesus says. The story is, all this wealth could be destroyed in a second. And I think that's a common fault that, that still runs through the world, that people want to create a life where they can do it. They think I can do it all myself. And they store up all of these things. But they learn and they think they're going to get true happiness from that. But then when they get older and start getting sick and getting disease, and they don't feel as good, they realize that, all this wealth isn't really doing anything good. And that's usually the end that people come to, that they may not realize that until later in their life.
Joe, what were you going to say?
I had some there, it was really brilliant.
Genius is right there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Part of what they said is that God was one. But it doesn't mean that you don't have anything to do. Like this, in the evening, 12 is Friday. God provided the oil that the Israelites had to do the test. They had to touch the oil, they had to kill it, they had to clean it, they had to roast it in order to have food. So God is providing a blessing, but it doesn't mean.
Right.
Yeah, it wasn't what they expected, they were expecting to sit on a platter,
Yeah, right,
something to
right.
come and wait on.
Yeah.
You have to work for it, that's very good, very important.
Doesn't just come with Chick-fil-A sauce on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say that, and maybe some people grumble, because, well, what do you mean we have to bow with the guy with this?
Yeah.
What kind of a thing? I'm sure there was some grumbling, but they were like,
Well, they don't want it opposite, but we have the same thing all the time. We want something else and
yeah. He said, well, this is what I want, but this isn't the way I wanted it.
Yeah. Joe, I think you make a valuable point there. We still have work to do with the blessings that he has given us, right? So I feel like that's what Charity and I are always kind of striving for. I feel like Charity subconsciously is trying to get rid of stuff we don't use or don't need, and I think she's tried to get rid of stuff that I wanted to hang on to. But that's, I think, a different thing. So the way that we're trying to kind of run our house is basically just making sure that we have what we need, and then taking care of our finances, but also recognizing that there's stuff that we can give, whether that is finances or whether that is extra clothing we don't need, right? It's, I think, this perspective that we're still trying to kind of lean into of always taking account of what we have, right? And it isn't just taking or getting, taking, but it's just managing what we have. And so in that way, we are able to bless Mormon. We are able to bless people who need stuff, right? And yeah, we've been incredibly blessed by you all. I mentioned like we needed to put in upducts a few weeks ago, right? And it so happens that Chris installed them professionally, right, for a time. And so he helped us. He actually just told me what to do, and I went and did it, and we worked together at it. But it was that idea of that we had this need. I asked, and the Lord provided the right man for the job, right? And it just goes both ways, right? There are things that he needs that I was able to kind of provide for. And so that is kind of what makes up this this reliance on one another, and then ultimately relying on God.
And I think too, it's a matter of separating needs from wants. So often our
Right.
wants can get confused with our needs.
Yeah.
We need to ask, do I really need that?
Yeah.
And I think what really happens, some good thing to do is to kind of look at some news stories from other places in the world, and you see how much hardship that a lot of people have, and then we'll look at our own life and say, my hardship is just 1% of what they're having. So we're better off than any place else.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like putting things in perspective once in a while.
Yeah.
The other thing I always like to look at in things like this is whenever they say bread, because all of these bread things really kind of go down to Jesus as being the bread of life. That's kind of the ultimate goal.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Yeah, but it's like at the temptation that Jesus has, when the devil says to him after he's baptized, turn these rocks into bread. And what does Jesus respond? He says, it is written, one should not live on bread alone, but every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. And so important. And then the prologue to John, of course, is in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it goes on to say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then Jesus is just going to say, I'm the true bread that came down from heaven. So all of these bread things have such a kind of a spectrum of fingers that go all the way through the scripture.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to kind of put those together.
Mhm.
And you have to remember that in ancient days, in 4th century, bread was almost so basic. That's what they ate every day. And if you didn't have bread, they often didn't have anything.
Mhm.
Bread was essential.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Right.
Sometimes
Yeah. I want to make just a few more remarks before we have a bathroom break. So I was talking about the importance of this direction of looking toward the wilderness. He says, behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. So the glory of the Lord is another important aspect in coming near to him, right? When we come near, we see his glory. And I think that it will ultimately set us up to see the glory of God within the bread of life, right? We know that Jesus is God's glory. In John's prologue, we see that we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son of the Father, right? And so it's kind of driving us toward this end. And then finally, we were talking about bread. I think I've mentioned this before, but I always feel like it's important to note that when they say, what is it? In Hebrew, they're saying ma'ana, manna, right? So the bread that they saw, they're saying, what is it? That's the name of the bread. the manna bread, the what is it bread. So there's what was that? Yeah, exactly. So it's just a fun play on words in the Hebrew text, right? The manna bread. But it will come into to play when we read John 6. So with that, we'll go on a little bathroom break, and then we'll continue on.
And the bathroom is open?
No,
No, it's
yeah,
not.
no. We don't need the bathroom itself.
interesting the way things happen. My wife and I came here 51 years ago, you know,
Mhm.
and the two kids grew up here. And one of them lived here for a long time. And we had three of our grandsons lived here, but over the last 5 or 6 years, we've all moved away.
Mhm.
So I say to my wife now, well, we're back the way we started. We came here just the two of us. That's the way we are.
Yeah.
We have one grandson that lives up in Oregon, and another one lives down by Pasadena, so we see them once in a while.
Mhm.
For the most part, we have to go to bed, you know. The
Right.
home that they started out, Ridgecrest, that's kind of boring now. That's a boring place. They, they live in the big city now, so.
It always seems like they come back. I always hear people who were born here go off and then they
I
come
know
and
so
stay.
many people like that, that
Yeah,
they come from
interesting.
somewhere else, and then I find out later that they originated here.
right. Yeah. Yeah, my parents just booked tickets to come visit us.
Oh, yeah.
So they'll be here at the end of August.
Oh, my
So-
God, it's too hot.
Yeah.
Right.
It'll be all right. I've got a few projects for my dad and I to work on.
Oh, outside.
Around, no, just around. the
Inside
house.
is
No,
good.
no.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, he's a mechanical engineer, so he's well versed
Yeah.
in projects.
I think we need to do you right, because you
Oh yeah,
keep following you.
yeah, a hard rake. Yeah.
This is the bathroom.
Let's see, men's room.
The black
There's
one.
the financial piece from that. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, it's been said that Ridgecrest, they wouldn't want to visit there.
Mhm. Yeah.
Ridgecrest is a great
Yeah. Yeah. My parents lived in Fullerton, California for a number of years.
That's
So
It's a
Yeah.
big city.
yeah, but so they've said, like we don't want to. We've seen, the California side of things, so they just want to stay here,
For
which is
sure.
great.
That's
Yeah.
it. How long are we staying?
A week,
Oh, yes.
yes. So they'll be here for one Sunday.
That's
They're
good.
flying out.
Yeah. Let's see, I think they're flying into LAX.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Are they, is your dad retired?
Not yet. My mom just retired.
Wonderful.
My dad lived in worked in Germany and France for a number of years. Yeah, so his retirement age kind of got pushed back a little bit because of taxes, I think. Didn't, yeah, I can't remember what he said about that, but
Was he working for the government?
no, he was working for Kimberly Clark. So he's made toilet paper all his life.
So it didn't run out when we, way back in
No.
the beginning of the pandemic, we ran out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's a mechanical engineer, and so he worked on the big paper mills,
Oh, yeah, right.
but now he's actually working for the county as an engineer.
The county?
Yeah, they live in a little town outside of Charlotte.
Mm.
So he was working for a paper mill, but it wasn't run really well. And so they were doing a lot of stuff he was saying wasn't prudent and just was a really stressful job. And so
Mhm.
he found this job for the county as the county engineer, and it's a lot easier.
Good.
And he said it's his going out job.
Good.
So
Well, yeah, you don't want to go stress on you.
No. yeah. So he likes it.
In Charlotte, in what state?
North Carolina.
Okay.
or I should say North Carolina.
Yeah. I was gonna say, y'all didn't say that.
No, right. Sure didn't.
You talk like Ruby.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say I'm linguistically neutral. So I kind of adapt to, yeah. Except I don't really ever say y'all. I always say you guys. Never adopted that. But my mom is German, and everybody says she's got a German accent, but I don't hear it. I just hear my mom.
You don't like, yes.
Yeah.
So was she born in Germany?
Yeah. So she was, I think, 25 or so. She lived there.
Oh,
And yeah.
So she kept the accent, sure.
Yeah. I'm sure I've shared this story, but one time when they had just moved to Shelby and they were looking for a church, I went with her to visit a church, and we sat down and had the service. And at the end, a guy came up and introduced himself to us, and they started talking. And this guy said, "Do I detect an accent?" And I was like, "No, sir, you're the one with the accent." But, right. Yeah.
I'll still to stamp that I'm
Man moet in Osnabrück uitgeboren.
großvater stamp out.
Okay.
It was funny, I was on the airplane once and I heard the people speaking German, so I asked them, stammen Sie aus Deutschland? And they said, nein, wir stammen aus Bayern. Which is Bavaria. And Bavaria is part of Germany. I guess they thought, though, Bavaria is, they're not just German, they're Bavarian.
Oh, right.
Bavaria.
Yeah.
They have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
It's beautiful in Bavaria. So,
Oh, yeah.
do you speak fluent German?
Well, yeah, I took it in school and I had a grandfather that was from Germany. And when I was young, I promised him that I would learn German and visit his hometown. And I finally did that in the year 2000. It took me like 50 years later to do it.
Yeah.
His hometown in Dresden?
But that was severely damaged during the war. So
Yes.
probably doesn't. And I found all kinds of people around that had the same last name that we had. And so my grandfather came to America. He was one of 12 in the family.
Oh my.
And he was the only one that came to America.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so probably got all kinds of relatives there. But
Yes.
and my uncle, my dad's brother, they used to get letters from Germany. But I was the youngest in the family. By the time I got older, those all disappeared.
Yeah.
Of course, they went through the war and everything. So many things, connections got broken.
What's your last name?
Well, my last name is Walters with an A.
Uh-huh.
But it turned out the family name was Walters with an O.
Okay.
That my dad, when he went to work, they made a mistake on his, or when he was born. I guess he was born during World War I. And I guess having a German surname wasn't good, so they put an A in there instead of an O.
Okay.
And so we didn't know that for a long time. And we decided, we'll just stick with the A.
That's interesting. My mom's side of the family's name is Wolfman.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very good German name.
And what's
Wolfman. Yeah.
what part of Germany is from?
Northwestern side. So it's about 2 hours by train ride out of Amsterdam. So when we visited 2 years ago, we flew into Amsterdam, and my uncle lives in near there. So then we took a train into Osnabrück.
Funny to me that plane, and for some reason we had to go through control. And so he went first, and then I got it, we went down and looked at it, and he was in German. It's story. Madame, And they might call her and you don't speak one.
Yeah. Nice. Yep. It's funny. All right, let's get back to the Bible. Let's read John 6 in the interest of time, just kind of make the literary connections. And then if, yeah, we'll have time, we'll go back to the Psalm and then Ephesians. Can I have somebody read the gospel text? All right.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. John. The next day, the people remained after the feeding of the 5,000, saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples. They themselves traveled to the boat and went to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I said to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate the sin of the Lord. Do not walk for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Then they said to him, what must we do to be doing the work of God? Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in me and he has sent. So they said to him, then what sign do you do, that we may see and believe you? What works did you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, to give them bread from the heaven to eat. Jesus answered to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave them the bread from heaven, but my Father. Give you the full bread from heaven, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst.
All right. So this passage is coming right after Jesus feeds the 5,000, John 6, 1 through 23. Yeah, we have that bit of context in that first verse. So yeah, we see the people coming to him and there's this exchange, right? And so they're wanting more of this bread. And it seems like it's a lot like the woman at the well. What I mean is Jesus is telling this woman that he has water that will make you never thirst, right? And so she's thinking literally, and she wants this water, this everlasting water, because she doesn't want to have to go back to the well day after day. But there is a deeper understanding there that he is that water. So in the same sense, we have that here. They're looking for this bread to eat, and they're thinking that, yeah, they won't ever have to eat again. They won't have to toil for grain and crush it and sift it and mill it and bake it and do all of that work so that they don't have to eat.
It's interesting to note that they fed the group of people not just before this and from looking for him, and he kind of says to them, well, they're just looking for something free, so to speak, and Jesus kind of tells them who he is. But then there's still that anticipation that they're looking for some free handout, And I know in the readings that come after this, then Jesus kind of gives them the bad news. I shouldn't say bad news, but it's the testing news, so to speak, saying, yes, I can give you this, but there's some conditions, it's not just going to be a free gift that's going to be
Yeah, so you're saying there's always a price to pay, right? And the thing that you pay for, you'll find more valuable, right? So in this sense, the price is believing that Christ is that bread of life. There's kind of a buy-in. So yeah, what are some things that stick out to you that are interesting from this passage, or what is it that is not making sense, or you find curious?
Like the word that says food that perishes, something that perishes, isn't gonna last forever.
Mhm.
So that's a distinction here. The real food is something that's going to be eternal. And that only Jesus can give them that.
Mhm.
The word perishes, I think, is important.
Yeah. And so then so is endures, the food that endures to eternal life. And it made me think of the collect, in which we're asking for help to run without stumbling. Just kind of thinking about how, as we are what we eat, right? So if we eat the bread of life, we eat Christ, we become like Christ, right? And I'm kind of mixing some metaphors here to kind of make this point that we're to endure and strive after becoming like Him. And when we are like Him, then we have life eternal. So Jesus says to them who ask, how do we get this bread? He says, this is the work of God, that you believe in Him whom He has sent. So they said to Him, then what sign do you do? So they understand that Jesus is saying that He was sent by God. So they're asking for this sign. What sign do you do that we may see and believe you? That's an important, or those two things are important in the Gospel of John: see and believe. If you remember in 1 John, the first few verses, he writes, all that we have seen, all that we have heard, all that we have touched with our own eyes, we proclaim to you. Or doubting Thomas, only if I see the nail pierced hands and feet, right? Or blind, the blind guy, of those who he received sight, right? So there's kind of this theme of seeing and believing. And then that blind guy who receives his sight, when the Pharisees asks him, like, who is it that restored this sight to you? And they keep pressing him to find this out. And finally, the blind guy says, do you also want to believe in Him? Or do you also want to follow Him? Right? It's kind of a some irony within the text of, what Jesus is doing.
I
Right.
remember in the past, some other places when the Pharisees, if somebody asked for a sign, and Jesus answered it several ways, and he kind of points out, well, the blind see, the lame walk, people who are dead are rising from the dead. And he kind of implies, well, what more signs do I need?
Yeah.
If you don't believe those, then you're not going to believe anything
Right.
else that he said. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like there's a stair step to believing in Jesus. It's
Mhm.
physical signs like healing the blind,
Yeah.
which kind of gives him the credentials that the strict Jews should have recognized what he was doing, because
Right.
this is all prophesied in the Old
Yeah.
Testament. But Jesus at one point says to the scribes in Jerusalem, have you not read the scriptures?
Yeah.
Which is one of the big complaints, that they read parts of it that they liked, but they didn't read,
Right.
they didn't connect Jesus with what was gone before them. So far as Jesus was concerned, they were ignorant of the scriptures, even though they were supposed to be experts. So
Yeah.
and that's
Right.
kind of an irony that's there too, that the scribes and the chief priests and everything in Jerusalem were supposed to be steeped in the scriptures, you know,
Yeah.
but obviously they weren't.
Yeah.
They saw only what they wanted to see.
Yeah, and the sign is there, well, Jesus did these signs, and the people who believe in those signs will be given bigger ones, you know, they'll go up farther. But if you don't believe in these, well, you know, it's like if you can't do basic arithmetic, you're not going to learn calculus.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, my footnote. When Jesus said, believe in him who he sent, the people must have understood that he was saying to be Christ. Therefore, they asked for a sign, despite the fact that they had just looked over.
Yeah. Yeah. So they set him up. They say, our fathers ate the manna, the what is it bread, in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you true bread from heaven, gives you the true bread from heaven. So they're implying, be like Moses and provide this bread from heaven. But Jesus then says, it wasn't Moses who gave them bread. It was the Father, right? The Father provided the manna, the what is it bread. So for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. So then he says, I am the bread of life. So to the question, the what is it bread? Jesus simply says, I am that bread. I am that bread. I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. So there's this, there's the difference between kind of the literal bread that we eat daily and then this spiritual bread that we eat, right? And so it's getting at a deeper hunger that we have as people. This hunger for purpose, this hunger for hope, this hunger for peace, this hunger for understanding the world around us. So when we eat of this heavenly bread, when we eat of Christ, we are satisfied. Now there's still myriads of mysteries within that. But just because it's mysterious doesn't mean that it's unknown. We walk deeper into the mysteries of Christ. And the deeper we walk, the more we're satisfied. And the more we crave it too, right?
It's kind of like a mystery. You can think of it as a stairway to heaven. We can always climb up more steps. We can always understand it more. But it's very profound, and we may never understand it on this earth because we're not going to get all the way up the stairs. But that still means that Jesus is asking us to climb up those stairs. You know, not to say, well, sometimes people look at a mystery and say, well, it's totally misunderstandable. May as well not even touch it because, you know, I can't understand. I can't get my arms around it totally. But I think Jesus is saying, even though you can't understand it fully, you still need faith to kind of walk up the stairs.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important sign, important attribute. You may not understand everything that's going on, but at least you'll understand it better if you kind of go along with it, do it, and follow.
Yeah.
That's the way I like to look at it, the stairway to heaven.
Yeah.
You may never get up to the top of the stairs, but you always get up another step.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I like the passage in Ezekiel that I was thinking about. And that's the passage where I believe the Lord gives to Ezekiel some scriptures to read. And Ezekiel reads it, but then the Lord asks him, "Will eat the scripture?" You know, so literally he's eating it. So
Yeah.
you like to think of, well, the words of scripture are like the words of Jesus. You have to eat them and it becomes part of your being, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of a duality there between the word of God and the words of scripture, so to speak.
Right. And it was as sweet as honey, right?
Yeah.
Do I remember that correctly? Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. I'm just saying it from memory. I
Right.
haven't looked at
Yeah.
it for a while.
Same.
It's funny how you think of things like that as you read stuff
Yeah.
like this, and I say, well, there's a connection there.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so nice, because so much of the scripture ties together in different places.
Mhm.
And the more you read and look, the more those ties you
Right.
see.
Yeah. Exactly. So we, as sacramental people, understand this text to help us understand what we do on Sunday, right? The Eucharist. We understand this to have this direct implication of when we partake of the Eucharist, eat and drink of the body and blood of Jesus Christ, we are consuming him. We are eating his flesh and drinking his blood.
My grandson, when he was maybe 4, came with us, with my husband, to the altar to receive communion and everybody was like, and he said, the blood of Christ, and he looked up and said, "You drink blood?"
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah. Out of the mouths of infants, right? Of babes. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so there, I mean, we can talk a lot about the mysteries of the Eucharist, right? This is, let's see. Yeah, I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, Bill, about Christ speaking in parables, right? Or enigmatically. There are things that don't quite make sense on surface level, but he is leading us to know what he is talking about. So in a sense here, we have Jesus saying some really profound things to people who looked at him as somebody who's crazy, right? As we look at the whole narrative of scriptures, we see God leading the Israelites in a place of infancy to growing them to a place where they can understand that the manna that the Father gave to them in the wilderness is setting them up for them to receive the bread of life that He is sending them through Jesus Christ. And in a sense, these people are still not understanding, but they have what they need to understand. And God is in the process of opening up their eyes. So we, as Anglicans, talk about the doctrine of reserve, which is the teaching where God is essentially reserving Himself to a point where we at some point can understand who He is, right? So He's not giving all of Himself all at one time for us to download and understand who He is, right? It's a process in which we go through to be able to understand over time. And sometimes we cycle back to the same lesson maybe 50 times, and like you were saying, Bill, reading Mark 100 times, right? And always kind of going back and understanding. So every time we go through the scriptures, we understand a little bit more. We go up that step, as you were talking about. And we're seeking God, and we're seeking understanding of who He is. And we do that by reading the scriptures, right?
There's that scene in the Gnostic Gospel somewhere where some of the chief priests, where they would go to his relatives in Nazareth and say, "You got to come and get this guy. He's a lunatic."
Right.
He's going around saying all these funny stories that don't make sense. They didn't understand what he was doing, so they thought he was kind of out of his mind.
Yeah.
Not quite all there.
Right.
And the same thing with Moses. The people when we started the first reading, they were grumbling. They thought, well, this isn't what we expected. So this Moses guy is really a fraud or a lunatic or something.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they're saying here.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have faith and don't believe, the things of God are going to appear to be lunatic.
Right. Yeah.
So they're often the unbelievable. They are the
Mm-hmm. I think I've shared this story before, but I think gets at this passage quite well. In Asheville, I was at a coffee shop, and I was dressed this way that I am and working on a sermon or whatever. And I was working at a long table, kind of a communal table, and this lady was sitting right across from me and started talking to me and asked me, who I am, what I do, and all of that stuff. And it turns out she was visiting Asheville from New York and is a Jew. And she was very open and very honest and was basically asking me for guidance, life guidance. She was just like, I need direction. And I was like, okay, I've never just had somebody come up and ask me for that. And so I started talking about scriptures and how we as Christians believe that the bread that we eat, the wine that we drink on Sunday, is the bread that your forefathers ate in the wilderness. And I said the manna that they ate is Christ. It's kind of prefiguring who Christ is. And I kept talking about that theme. And at one point, after I stopped for a second, she just looked at me and said, "What the hell are you talking about?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? Like it's crazy."
Jesus says that when he explains the parable to the people, he explains the parable to the apostles.
Yeah.
And then he says the people will hear but not understand.
Yeah.
Listen but not comprehend. He kind of says they're not going to know what he's talking about. It's
Right.
going to seem to be totally illogical and lunacy.
Yeah. I did wrestle with, should I have said that? Should I have, should I have said something else? A different
You would see
tactic.
that theme with Christians who know year,
Mhm.
and she would have recognized.
Well, I think she did, right? But I think it's that leap, right? Yeah.
Faith,
But who knows? Maybe the Lord used that as a seed, right?
yes.
Hopefully, we can pray for that.
So when she left, she wasn't convinced that that was.
No, we ended up talking about Passover and
Yeah,
other stuff, and
sure.
but it was still a good conversation and a good experience for her to ask, like, what the hell are you talking about?
Right, she was honest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm trying to remember of the other synoptic gospels. If Jesus says, I am the bread, I know he says, in the institution narratives, he says, yeah, this is my bread and my blood, right? But never really as explicit as John does, as I am the bread of life. So it's an interesting characteristic of what John is doing in his gospel. And certainly gives us more insight into kind of the mysteries of who Christ is. And it kind of goes back to the overall time in which this message needs to take to cure or to grow within in the people that Jesus taught, right? So in Mark is one of the earliest gospels that we have, followed by Matthew and Luke, and then the Gospel of John wasn't written until maybe 30 or 40 years later. And so it's just the same take, but kind of a different, maybe deeper understanding of what Christ does in kind of within the other Gospels. So
I
it's
like to think of John kind of takes what's in the other gospels that were kind of maybe a little bit vague and implied and makes them a little more blunt, more explicit about it.
yeah,
Like yeah, it's there, but wasn't as clear as it could be. So John's going to make it a little bit clearer.
right, yeah, good.
So the thing in John is just kind of had threads that go back to the gospel. But John kind of puts more meat to it, so to speak.
Right. So let's read the psalm. Can I have somebody read that? Any takers? All right, John.
Hear my teaching, and my confess. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth to the hill, and will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and such as the forefathers have told us, that we should not hide from the children of the generation to come, but show the honor of the Lord, his mighty and wonderful work that he has done. He made a covenant with Jacob and gave Israel a law, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children, that their posterity might know, and the children which were yet unborn, with the intent that when they came up, they might share it to their children, that they might put their trust in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. Not as the forefathers, the faithless and stubborn generation. The generation did not see the heart of life, and their spirit did not cleave steadfastly to God. Like the children of upward, our troops turned both and turned back in the way of God. They did not keep the covenant of God, and did not work in his law, but forgot what he had done and the wonderful works that he had shown them. Marvelous things to be given in the sight of the forefathers in the land of Egypt, even in the field of his children. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
it seems like this psalm is appropriate after reading the Exodus passage and John. Like there's something important that we're to pass on to our children and pass it on what has been passed on to us, right? So the psalmist is saying, hear my teaching, O my people, incline your ear to the words of my mouth. So we have this important teaching that we have. The teaching is that of who God is. If we go all the way down to the last verse there, number 13. No problem. Take care. Thanks for joining us. It says, marvelous things he did in the sight of our forefathers in the land of Egypt, even in the field of Zoan. So as we were talking about earlier, how God was revealing himself to his people, and to a people that were infants in their faith and their life. Yeah, he did really marvelous things in their sight. Right? The fire, the frogs, the locusts, the blood, everything, the parting of the Red Sea, those things are really marvelous.
I always refer to, in the Old Testament later after we came out of Egypt later, it says, I am the God who led you out of Egypt. That was kind of like the calling card. They led them out of Egypt and gave them a land of their own, and they kept referring to that throughout there for a long time after that. And so it's the God who led you out of Egypt. That was the big event that they had. And they should remember that. He was kind of pointing out to that, but this is the same God that did all this for you. And you need to remember that they were forgetting that and falling into bad ways and all that. And it's a typical human trait that good things can happen, but yet we'll kind of go astray because nothing has happened recently.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Because we have short memories and all the good things that maybe happened, weeks ago, we kind of forget about that.
Yeah.
Because nothing good has happened today.
Right.
That's kind of an interesting way to put it.
Yeah. And it's, like you were saying, it's one of the main things that God reminds the people of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And it's just as important to us too, because in 1 Peter, he writes that the Exodus and going through the waters prefigures our baptism, right? He writes for us to remember our own baptism in the same way that God reminds the Israel of the passing through the sea or having the waters part. So it's interesting to kind of see this within the context of scriptures that is God who has led us out of the land of Egypt, or in kind of the sense out of the land of our bondage. And then through the waters of baptism or the Red Sea, we are free.
Kind of like being in bondage, like being a slave to sin, so to speak.
Right.
Baptism, the cleanse of that. They probably forgot that after a while.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the point of this passage. We see verse 3, which we have heard and known, and such our forefathers have told us. So we have kind of the first instance of this teaching to us. Our forefathers are teaching us of God who has led us out of the place of bondage. Verse 5, 4, he's saying that we should not hide them from our children of the generations to come. So we're to teach them so that we might see the mighty and wonderful works that he has done. Verse 5, he has made a covenant, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children, so that those children, verse 6, might know it, and the children which were yet unborn. And verse 7, intent that when they came up, they might show it to their children. So it's a repeating point, right? That we are to receive what has been given to us by our forefathers and then give them to our children. Right? And it's important. Right.
Don't see why there's more water.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, and it's God's grace, or by God's grace, that message remains despite the faithlessness of that generation, right? And yeah, that doesn't give us the license to be faithless like them, knowing that God will still do what he intends to do, right?
And when it says at the top there that talks about the parable and the other dark sayings of old, it's kind of a prophecy that Jesus will come and fulfill and complete and make explicit all of these things that happened in the past. I think that's a good prophecy that makes these dark sayings, all other dark things of old, but do them in a more blunt or serious or explicit manner.
Mm.
And of course, the word of parable was something I didn't understand. They were just funny stories that they didn't really figure out what they're all about. So I think that's a lot of good things.
Mm.
One thing I found that I've been having trouble with, especially with my grandsons, is they don't seem to be too interested in things that happened long ago. I'll say something like, well, when I was young, we finally got a TV set and we had one TV station. And they said, one TV station, what did you do? Live in the dark ages or something?
Yeah.
And then I said, well, when we wanted to get a book, we had to go to the library. Oh, and I said, we didn't have computers. I said, what? We didn't have computers? You know, they think that things that were like that, years ago, that was like, oh, they're not interested in trash like that. I must be just telling them yarns and I must be exaggerating.
Yeah.
But, so I kind of in some ways given up saying like that because they don't seem to be that interested in things that happened long ago when things are different than they are now.
I think you need to continue telling them that stuff. What I always think about the story of the giver. Did you ever read that?
I think
Lois Lowry.
okay.
It's all about this utopian community where there's two people whose job is to hold the memories of humanity, essentially, or the memories of the community. So throughout the whole story, there's the giver of the memories and the receiver of the memories, right? So I picture you all as people who are older than I am, of people who are holding the memories of times past, right? Like I've never lived in a time where we only had one station on the TV, right? I had, I think, like 12.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we used to point to somebody's house that has a TV station. Yeah. And they were pretty elite. They said, oh, they've got TV. Because they had this antenna up on the roof. So that was pretty
Yeah.
elite. If you had
Right.
a TV set, you were pretty much high class in the world.
And the one
We
time we
have
got
our-
our stock out of it.
Yeah.
We had the first house in the neighborhood.
oh wow.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal.
And they used to come and watch people watch that.
Oh yeah.
Remember?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we had this piece of plastic. We put it across the TV set, the top was blue.
Oh,
and
yeah.
In the middle was kind of flesh colored, and then at the bottom was green. So that was color TV.
But ours didn't do that.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
And I remember when I told them, well, when I was young, I had to walk to school and it was a long ways and it was bad weather with rain and wind and fog and walked anyway.
That was uphill both ways.
Well, I didn't quite go that far, but just the fact that I had to go out in the rain, wear raincoat and all that. And go to school every day and there was no bus or anything to take you because the school was only 3/4 of a mile away, and that wasn't considered busable. You didn't need the bus to go short distance like that, so.
Yeah. But it's, I think, important for your grandchildren to hear that, right? Because there will be a time that they'll think back about crazy old granddad, and how life was before.
I told my girls, I've been thinking about it, and I got this, but I'm gonna make a journal. And on the title page, it's gonna say, this is not an online order, but as you can pop in, I'm gonna write them down.
Mhm.
So that, so that you will have some idea of what it was like
Mhm.
to hear my
Mhm.
My granddad was a writer. We were sitting at the radio on. We interrupt the broadcast because we were falling. Japanese and long haul. And my granddad used to talk to my mother. And I back there.
Mm.
And it's still good. I didn't really understand what was going on.
Mhm.
But it's something really bad.
Mhm. Right.
And it's funny, isn't it? I think I'm not. Things just pop in and you don't really, what triggers the memory, you don't know, all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to find it.
Yeah. So those
And I'm gonna
things,
tell them, it's not a read.
yeah. Those things are important, and it's also important to tell them about how the Lord has provided, right? Like those that's what the psalmist is kind of getting at in this passage. They're just as important as these memories that we have.
It seems like this is all moving away. Little by little, each day.
Mhm.
I remember as a kid. In the neighborhood, everybody.
Mhm.
When the sign was going on, it's here and here and here.
Right.
And we used to walk to church, and you'd see a big stream of people going down the street.
Mhm.
We got to let go of a few things, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, technology is a big thing. It's a helpful thing, but it's created a society that's comfortable with ease, right?
Yeah.
And access.
Yeah, television,
Yeah.
as kids, we didn't have television. All the kids were outside playing.
Yeah.
On
And
shelves.
so think about the challenges that, I mean, like my generation and Malachi's generation have. So I don't know if you know, but psychologically, these screens and colors have a huge effect on brain development, right? And we see a lot of kids with screens in front of them, and that's literally altering their brain.
Yeah.
So much so that they can figure out touch screens, right? They can figure that out, but they can't build blocks. Like I've seen a study where that has been the case, in which kids are not able to fit blocks on top of one another, right? And so that's, I mean, the temptation might be like, oh, you kids like have no idea. Like we've kind of created that for them, and it's sad. And so yeah, I feel like that will be a huge part of my ministry, you know, to younger generations and to my own family. And that's why we're trying to, yeah, decrease screen time for Malachi, who's just 8 months old, right? Yeah, and yeah, even then, I'm still scared, right? Scared of the effects of it. But so to get back to the question, how do we do that? How do we get back to that? It takes effort, and it'll be at a great expense. We will have to get rid of a lot of things, and we will have to become comfortable having to do things the hard way. Yeah, like navigation, right? We all depend on GPS, and yeah, like
Nobody reads maps.
right. And actually,
It's like we first read, there's a lot of stumbling blocks.
there's so many stumbling blocks. That's why we're praying this prayer, right? That we need God's grace to help us to run the race without stumbling, so that we might inherit the heavenly promises. Yeah.
Did you ever have an erection set?
Sorry?
You know what an erection set?
An erector set. No.
Well,
Okay.
I still got pieces back.
Do you have
Now my grandkids, and they say, what in the world is that?
It's the little pieces of steel. And you could bolt them together. They're really nuts and screws, and you could make all kinds of things. And, well, that's one of my favorite toys. And then,
I do know Lincoln Logs. Yeah, I've heard of them. Yeah.
Father taught my mom. What is something really horrendous that I know? From our before. What if something like that happened? to you?
What'd you say?
So you need when?
Who's going to be left?
Right? Mhm.
Who would know how to think that?
Yeah.
no food.
Anyone, and if you happen to have how to survive, we should know this.
Right. Who would know that their hamburger came from that cow?
That's right.
Yeah.
Think about it for a minute.
Yeah. Right.
Well, think of the food. That's really tough.
Yep. On that note, yeah.
Straight up. that Jesus didn't come back.
Yeah.
I mean, look. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, we as humans are really adaptable. So if that does happen, somebody will. Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's funny when you try to do something good, there's always going to be opposition.
Mhm.
It's important to know, it's like, sometimes I'll tell stories to my grandsons and then somebody will say, oh, you told them that. Or don't tell them that story, they're not listening, So there's always these deterrents that people think when you're trying to tell things to your grandchildren that happened in the past, and some people think, oh, they're not interested in things like that.
Mhm.
And that's what often kind of makes it difficult, because even people And Jesus says that what he says, a brother will turn against sister and father against daughter, all of that. That it's funny when you try to do something good, even your friends and close relatives are gonna criticize you for doing it. Going, oh, they're not listening. Oh, you said that once. I said that a year ago and they didn't remember it, so why am I saying, what I'm saying is
Yeah.
there's always gonna be opposition when you try to do something good. But then it sends you back and I start to think, oh, am I really out of my mind? Am I really foolish in doing this? And I always regroup and say, oh no, I'm gonna try it again, despite the flack that you're gonna get for
Right.
doing that.
Yeah. And I think it's a byproduct of our society that is essentially putting less value on older people.
Yeah.
Right.
That's kind of what's happening. Older people are thought to be senile and brainless.
Right.
And they're not good for anything.
Yeah.
And I think, that the problem is some people are letting that happen.
Right.
They think, well, how do you prepare for retirement or whatever? You think the only way you prepare is to have enough money. But I think there's a lot of other ways you can prepare for older age that don't have anything to do with money, just to keep your brain active. And just to do things that are kind of takes a little bit of thought, and that way you can talk to other people in a reasonable manner.
Yeah.
And in so many ways. So there's so many ways to prepare for what I say retirement or old age. It has nothing to do with money, and money is probably that's a factor there. You don't want to ignore that, but there's a lot of things that are more important to that. And there's no point to having a lot of money if your brain's dead.
Yeah.
And I found that happened with so many friends that I used to work with. And I used to talk to them a lot, about things going on in the news, and I'll see them and I'll ask, oh, did you hear about this on the news? And they'll look at me like, what? What am I talking about? They don't know what you're talking about anymore. And so many of my friends are, I don't want to say this, but they're gone, but they become brain dead. And I know that's kind of an insult, but I don't say that directly to them. It's kind of insulting. But the problem is that they don't realize it.
Right.
Yeah, they don't realize that it's not. But I found that the age of people not being able to think clearly is coming down.
Yeah.
In age, so many people don't do things to keep their brain active.
Right.
When they stop working, when they stop working, it's time to, what are they going to do? I ask people that say, oh, they're going to retire next year. What are you going to do? Oh, I'll find something to do. So you need to have something in mind.